Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is John Gaspard. Hey, John, how are you doing?
Good to be back. Hi, Matty.
Bye. And as John said, he is a returning guest. We'll be hearing about what episodes he has been in just a moment. But to give our listeners and viewers just a reminder of your background, John Gaspard is the author of the Eli Marks Mystery Series, the Como Like Players Mystery Series, and 4 standalone novels. He hosts 2 podcasts, Behind the Page, the Eli Marks Podcast, and the Occasional Film Podcast. And John has directed 6 low-budget features that cost very little and made even less. And John and I have talked twice on the podcast. In episode 145, we talked about speech to text and back again, about dictation and AI and all sorts of fun things like that. In 128, we talked about lessons from filmmaking for the Indy Author. And John is coming back because some of what we talk about, he formalized into his new book, The Popcorn Principles, A Novelist's Guide to Learning from the Movies. And so this is going to be a nice extension of the conversation we'd had earlier about filmmaking. And John has not surprisingly arranged his advice into pre-production, production, and post-production. And so what I thought we'd do is just pick a couple of examples from each of those categories. John's going to share a little bit more about his film background as we do that. But John, let us just start right out with pre-production. And I looked through, there were 5 principles that you listed, but one of the ones that attracted my attention was stay in your lane.
Yes, stay in your lane, which generally means don't jump genres. But I'm not a huge, quote unquote, right to market person, but I do think you make a contract with your reader when you start a story that is going to fulfill their expectations. You certainly want to surprise them, absolutely, but you don't want to confuse them. And for me, there were a couple examples in the movie world that I took when I started writing Eli Marks, because Eli Marks is a rather traditional cozy mystery series about a magician who solves crimes. But I wanted to make sure that I was hitting all the right grooves for that sort of thing. And I was reminded of, there's a filmmaker named Roger Nygaard, who I knew when I was much younger, and now he's at LA and he's editing Curb Your Enthusiasm and Veep, but he's also a filmmaker and has made several features, one of which was called Suckers. And Suckers is based on stories of a friend of his who sold cars, and it takes place in a car dealership. And it's very funny. It's very wild and wacky about the life of a car salesman. But about 2/3 of the way through the movie, it shifts tone and becomes a thriller mob movie. And Roger has said to me that it hurt the movie because he said we made one promise up front and then it became something else. And viewers didn't like that. They wanted to know what they were getting and then get that. A bigger example would be Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez when they're both first starting out and just got going in Hollywood. They made a movie called Dusk Till Dawn with George Clooney, and it was advertised as a heist movie, as a criminals on the run. And about a third of the way in, it turned into a really bloody, gory vampire movie. And audiences reacted by going, well, that's not what you said you were going to give us. So it's important to be sure you know what it is you're offering and promising, and then do that. And then everything that supports your books, your cover and your blurb and all that, have to do it as well. I'll just give one more example. George Romero, who was famous for making the Night of the Living Dead films, the first zombie movies, made a movie called Martin. And Martin is a quote unquote vampire movie about a young man named Martin who thinks he is a vampire. And it was released as a vampire movie. The problem was that the movie that George Romero made was about a young man who was mentally ill who thought he was a vampire. And although there are a couple of the vampire tropes in there, it really is not a vampire movie, even though it's kind of about a vampire. The marketing didn't help. And the movie, although quite a good movie, suffered because the people who wanted to see it didn't know what it was. And the people who thought they knew what it was were unhappy with what they saw. So it's really, really important to find your lane and stay there.
This is an interesting entree. I won't go into it too much because I don't want it to be a spoiler for a future episode. But in an episode that's going to be coming up, I talk with Christina Adams and Jennifer Hill, who was on the podcast talking about the trope thesaurus. We watched 10 Cloverfield Lane, which is a bizarre twist. That upcoming episode is going to be all spoilers. I won't include a spoiler now, but it was one where there was like a promise through most of the movie, and then at the end it switched around. So if you're looking at something like those examples that you gave, or 10 Cloverfield Lane, Can you give an example of what an author would look for in their own book that would say, "Oop, I'm about to do a Martin," or "I'm about to do a From Dusk to Dawn" kind of thing?
Well, it really connects to, I know you picked two things out of the pre-production section. The second one was be committed. You got to be committed. Making that commitment at that point in the process solidifies what it is you're doing. And at that point, I am doing a vampire story or I am doing a comedy about car sales. Making that commitment early on and then sticking to it is very important. It's when you're not committed to what you're writing and you go, well, I think I'll take a left turn here because I'd rather go left right now. Then you go, well, okay, you haven't committed to your idea and it's going to suffer because all of a sudden you made a left turn that might be more interesting for you, but is not what the audience really wanted.
I can imagine in an early episode, I think I was talking with Brian Meeks about this, but we were talking about the benefits of writing your book description before you start writing the book. Because I think most people go into a book saying, I really want to write a story about how a woman deals with an extraordinary ability in the ordinary world. That's usually the background of the books I write. And if you write all that out, like if Quentin Tarantino had written out what he wanted the blurb for the movie to say, then maybe his producers might have looked at that and said, this is odd, Quentin, because here you're talking about, something very different at the later. Do you think that would help avoid that kind of switch in the middle, the not staying in your lane?
Yes. It also helps for those of us who are indie authors, because I think what probably happened with Tarantino's film From Dusk Till Dawn with Robert Rodriguez was I think the marketing people looked at it and went, we have George Clooney, who was a huge star at that time. It feels like a heist film, like a kidnapping film. Let's push that and not let the audience know. And I'm a big fan of, trailers not spoiling the movie. I appreciate that. But in that case, I think they held their cards a little too close to the chest. And I think they really should have gone a little deeper in the marketing because both Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez are very smart writers and they knew what they were doing. What happened was their marketing people didn't know what they were doing and sent the wrong message. And so, like you say, if you get your blurb written up front, if you have an idea what you want for your cover and do your cover right away, in my instance, the cover designer I use is a very popular cover designer. And so I need to give him several months warning as to when I'm going to need a cover. And I may not know the specifics. I will know the title and probably in the case of Eli Marks, the general trick that's going to be involved. So he has some hooks to make a cover on. But then when I'm writing, I'm writing toward that cover.
Oh, yeah, that's great. It would be very inspirational to have something over your writing desk that was the cover and the blurb. That would be a really nice directional thing.
And if you don't have that, I know this makes me very old school, but mood boards, which you can now do on your computer very easily, just finding images that express what you're feeling for your story and having that as a thing you keep going back to will help keep you on track. Because if you are writing something, you look over and go, oh, boy, there's nothing in the mood board like this. Is this part of the story or I made a left turn I didn't want to make? Just getting that sense so that you are committed to it. It's that commitment that I think I just heard a great interview with Will Ferrell. And he was talking about when he started at Saturday Night Live, he walked in and he thought, I'm funny. I'm probably not the funniest person here, funnier than some people here, but there is no one here who's more committed to what I'm doing. And that was and is his secret. He is entirely committed to doing whatever he's doing. He said if a sketch was going poorly, people's instinct would be to speed up. He would slow down. He said, if you're not enjoying it now, just wait. We're going to really make you work for this. He had that lack of ego, I guess, to just go, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this work. I'll go back to George Romero. When he made Night of the Living Dead, which is a classic black and white horror film, up until that point in his career, that was his first feature. He had made probably hundreds of TV commercials, high-end TV commercials, glossy TV commercials. And he knew with the budget he had, he couldn't do anything like that. And he decided and made the commitment to, I'm going to make a horror film. I'm not going to wink at the camera. I'm not going to step back. I'm not going to be ashamed of this. I'm going to make the best horror film I can. Another example is Jonathan Demme, who went on to make Silence of the Lambs and other classic films. One of his first movies, in fact, I think the first movie he directed was a women in prison film called Caged Heat for Roger Corman. And Roger Corman told me he said, because of Jonathan Demme's commitment to what he was doing, he said, I'm going to make the best women in prison film I can. And Corman said it was the directors who he worked with who had that sort of commitment, who didn't look down on the genre, but just said, I'm going to do the very best version I can. He said, they're the ones who are still working. The ones who didn't commit are the ones who didn't have careers. So it's really, really important to not only come up with the idea, but commit to the idea all the way through the end.
Well, your reference to Will Ferrell made me think of the cowbell skit. And the fact that I think that's a great example of throwing yourself into it. And if nobody has seen the cowbell skit, then search Saturday Night Live cowbells and more cowbell.
Yeah.
And it also made me think of it because Will Ferrell doesn't look particularly attractive in that skit. Like, as I recall, his t-shirt is too short. It makes him look fat and his stomach's hanging over his pants. And, he's kind of a mess. Like, Will Ferrell's putting it all out there, literally and figuratively, in order to get the laughs. And same kind of thing with authors. If you're not willing to put it all out there to get whatever the effect is that you're going for, that might be a red flag as well.
Yep. You've really, that level of commitment is so important, and it'll see you through everything else. If you're committed to it, no matter how dark the days get, if you are committed to the thing you're doing, that'll get it done.
And I think another sort of mechanical thing people could do to check against the stay in the lane advice is there are lots of books. I mentioned Jennifer Hilt. It has the trope thesaurus. She has one for horror. She has one for romance. There are books like The Story Grid, which go over the conventions of various genres. So if you're writing horror and you find you just written a meet cute scene, like maybe you need to rethink that, because I don't know that meet cute is a part of any horror convention.
Unless you're doing like Shaun of the Dead, which is a pastiche. However, the commitment that Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg made in that script was, we're going to do both things simultaneously. We're going to do a romantic comedy about a guy who's trying to get to his girlfriend, and we're going to do a zombie film. We're going to do them both straight. And they did. And that's why that film holds up so well, because they were committed. They didn't change lanes. They were doing two lanes at the same time and were committed to both of them.
Yeah. The other thing that's reminding me of, I just watched The Menu, Ray Fiennes, and it was billed as horror. It was billed as horror and obviously had a eating a meal theme, which sort of brings up all sorts of unfortunate things that might happen in it. My husband actually declined to watch it with me, but I watched it and I figured, this is the advantage of streaming. I can just turn it off if it it's actually was not particularly gory, and it was quite funny. It was intended as a satire, but whatever it was about how they had advertised it suggested something different that ended up having them lose my husband as an audience member because he was expecting something gorier. So again, making sure that you're not making promises that drive people away, but also not making promises that pull people in and then are alarmed, like the movie becomes more gory than they thought, or they want gore and it's a heist movie, or whatever the example is. Like, make sure there's a commonality there between what you're advertising and what you're providing.
Exactly.
So why don't we move on to the second principle we're going to be talking about within pre-production, which is you've got to be committed. We've talked about that a little bit already. Are there other details behind you've got to be committed that we should discuss?
I will just once again mention the Night of the Living Dead thing, because people don't realize what a groundbreaking movie that was in 1968. They also, like I mentioned, don't realize that this was not a group of teenagers. Not that there's anything wrong with teenagers running out and making movies. This was a group of guys and women in their 30s who had careers, who looked at what they had, which was X amount of dollars. They wanted to make a movie which would allow them to make another movie, which is kind of the goal in movie making. None of them wanted to make a horror film. However, they realized that was really their only avenue. And so they committed to it 100%, to the degree that one of the producers was cast in the lead, and they were auditioning other parts. And this guy came in, Dwayne Jones, and he blew everybody away. He was a young black man, and he was not what they had envisioned for the movie, but he was perfect for the movie. And they were committed to making the best movie they could. And so the producer, who was also going to act, said, I'm stepping back because this guy's going to make it a better movie. And he did. Dwayne Jones is fantastic in that movie. And it was their single-minded focus on, this is what we've committed to do, and we're going to do everything we can to make this as strong as possible, up to and including shooting an ending that they knew distributors would say to them, we need an alternate ending because that's too bleak, but they knew the audiences would be blown away by their ending. And so they didn't even shoot a second ending. They said, this is take it or leave it. This is the ending, because they were completely committed to, they knew their horror audience was going to react to that.
Yeah, I like that idea that you need to recognize what you're giving up. Like there might be some movie theaters that aren't going to play that movie at all. So you're losing that audience, but you're making a stronger connection with the people who are interested in what you have. And so you have a somewhat smaller, but much more committed audience than if you dumb it down in order to broaden your audience, but maybe weaken the connection.
Yeah, they wanted to make the strongest movie they could. And that's what they were committed to.
There's also sort of the connection with Be Willing to Kill Your Darlings, because you can imagine that producer might have been really excited about having a part in the movie. Maybe he wasn't, maybe he was happy to step aside, but you can imagine he might have been saying, okay, well, I was really excited about doing this, but I realized that for the good of the work, it's going to be necessary for me to not do that. That's the equivalent of being able to, I love this scene, but is it supporting what I want to achieve? Maybe not.
Well, yeah. And that brings to mind a slightly more contemporary example, than not more contemporary. When Kevin Smith made Clerks, the original ending of Clerks, which is a goofy day in the life of a guy behind the counter at a convenience store, highly profane, very silly, very funny. The very last scene in the movie before they sent it to Sundance was the clerk is just closing up. The last customer comes in. The clerk says, we're closed. Customer shoots him, kills him, robs the store, and leaves. That was the ending. And even the actor who was shot said, I don't think this is the same movie. It's not the same movie. And wiser heads prevailed. The guy who was the film agent who was taking it to Sundance said, look, the ending doesn't work for this movie. I know you love the ending. Let's take the ending off right now and bring it to Sundance and see if anyone will buy it. And then if someone buys it, we can talk about the ending back on. And of course, they never put that ending back on. But it was an example of he was making one promise to the audience, and at the end, he turned it and made it really grim. And wiser heads said, that's not going to work. That's just not going to work. And I'm not really sure if Kevin Smith would still be Kevin Smith if he'd had that ending on that movie.
The other example that reminds me of, the opposite example, is Thelma and Louise, where I don't know what the original ending was, but the image at the end of Thelma and Louise, where the shot from below and the car sort of soaring, seeming to like soar into the sky, and it's the action is exactly the same, but the tone you leave with is so much different. And again, a lesson for authors as they're closing out their book. Remember that the last things you're writing are the things that are going to linger with the reader afterwards. Any lessons there that you want to talk about?
Well, we have a whole chapter on endings and the importance of endings and killing your darlings. And my favorite one is from The Big Chill. I talked to Carol Littleton, who was the editor on that movie. And The Big Chill famously was going to end with a flashback 20 years before, 15 years before, whatever it was, all the characters younger in college putting together a Thanksgiving dinner. And that's where we were going to meet Alex, the guy who dies at the beginning of the movie, who was played by Kevin Costner. And we're going to see how all of these people interacted as their younger selves. And the editor, Carol, said to Lawrence Kasdan, the writer-director, when she read the script, I don't think you need that scene. And he said, you're so wrong. I wrote the movie. I'm making the movie because of that scene. That's the most important scene. She said, fine. So they shot it. And as they're shooting it, she said, it looks kind of silly. It looks like a masquerade party. No, it's the best scene. And then she said, we tried to put it in the movie. We tried it at the end. We tried it at the beginning. We cut it up and put it throughout. It never really worked. So we got it the best position we could at the end. And we showed it to audiences, and audiences loved the movie, and then they hated it. So they got bad cards back on the previews. And so she said, why don't we do two versions, one with that ending, one with another ending that will cobble together. And the ending of The Big Chill is a little cobbled together. I mean, it just sort of ends. And they showed both versions to different audiences, and the numbers spoke for themselves. People loved the movie without that. And as Carol Littleton had said to him, you may have needed that scene to write it. You absolutely may have needed that scene to write it, but you didn't need it in the movie. And I think that often happens where we write things in our books. That's the thing I wrote the book for. And then you get the whole book done and you go, yeah, but I don't really need that anymore. that's not really helping me anymore. I needed it to write, but the reader doesn't need to read it.
Yeah, I can imagine an analogy for authors there is trying to recognize those things as early as possible, because if Lawrence Kasdan had recognized that he really just needed that in his own writer notebook and it never needed to be shot, they probably would have saved Kevin Costner's salary, because I think in the end, I doubt if it was Kevin Costner's wrist that shows up on the morgue table in the.
I think it is. I believe it is his wrist and his hair at the beginning.
Oh, it's.
I believe it is. Yeah. And it was
But
going
if
to
he'd
be
known
kind
they
of
weren't going to shoot the thing, they could have just gotten some arbitrary guy to provide the hair and the wrist.
It gave him a great story.
Yeah, exactly. But, the analogy I think would be try to recognize those things that you only need for yourself. So you're investing only as much time in them as you need to for your own purposes, not making it reader ready when it may never be reader ready, or may never need to be reader ready.
The piece that you wrote that maybe doesn't actually fit in the book might be a nice little reader magnet thing you can give away for free and pull people in. But if it's not helping the story, I got to chat with Nicholas Meyer, who wrote The 7% Solution and directed Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan, and other movie time after time. And he had that same reaction, which was, doesn't matter why you put it in there. In the end, as you're finishing your project, in his case, he was talking about a movie, if it doesn't help, it has to go. It has to go. It's not helping anybody and is making things worse. And that's, the ego has to leave and you just have to go, I'm sorry, that's gone.
Yeah, you have to take off your filmmaker hat and put on your editor hat.
Yep.
Same thing for writers. So we're going to move on to part 2, which is production. And I'm very intrigued by your principle, which is come in late, leave early.
Yes. Well, I can't take credit for that entirely. That's been around for a long time in screenwriting. I first heard it from Paul Schrader, who wrote Taxi Driver, which is his analogy was, think of each scene as a party, a cocktail party. And you as a guest, a reader or a viewer, you want to get there as late as possible so that things are already up and running, and you want to leave before things die down. And that's how a scene should work. You should get in as late as you can, reasonably get in. You should get out before it peters out. And if you start looking for it in movies, you can see that all over the place, where they'll cut from one thing right into the action of the next thing. The example I use in the book, and it's an old example, but it's a classic example for me, is the movie The Producers with Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder. And the editor of that movie, Ralph Rosenblum, wrote a great book about all the different movies that he edited. And he explained how there's a sequence in The Producers where Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder are going to meet the playwright who owns the worst play in the world, Springtime for Hitler. And they meet him on his roof, and then he says, let's go inside and talk about it. And they sit at his kitchen table. The kitchen table scene, as it is in the movie now, was twice as long when they shot it. There was a lot of stuff once they got into the kitchen and they're getting settled, and the Franz character is talking, and then he bursts into a song and makes them sing. And in the editing, Ralph Rosenblum said to Mel Brooks, that's where the scene starts, right there. And Mel Brooks is like, well, that's like 3 minutes into this. You're losing all this stuff. He said, yes, you're losing all this stuff, but you don't need all that stuff. Everything you need to know, the actors are telling you right now. You can see how uncomfortable they are. You can see how crazy he is. We can lose pages of dialogue and get to it faster. And so, Mel Brooks did that, was not happy about it. And then he did the same thing at the end of the scene. There's a point where he says, sign the contract here. And that's the end of the scene. And there's a tendency to want to be a completist and go, well, I'm going to show you everything that happened from the time the lights came on until the time the lights went off. When in fact, you just need to show that part where the character's going through something and then quickly move on to the next thing.
Is there a way that authors can use beta readers, maybe in a non-traditional way? I mean, I think most people write up their story and then they give to beta readers and they take comments. But I don't know that I've heard about people doing the equivalent of what that film editor was doing for Mel Brooks, where he could have just been seeing that scene in isolation. And if he was an astute editor, as he obviously was, then he might have been able to make that suggestion even without seeing the surrounding material. Do you think that there's any way that authors can show scenes to readers and say, like, how much of this can I cut out in order to come in late, leave early?
That'd be hard to do, because in the case of The Producers, what Ralph was responding to was the whole thing and keeping the pace going through the whole thing. A good editor can help you do that. It'd be a lot to ask of a reader to help you do that, because they just for the same reason that when a beta reader says, here's the problem with the story and here's the solution, they may be 100% right about what the problem is. They're usually wrong about the solution, of how to solve that problem. That was always the case when I was showing previews of movies. People, they could zero in on the problem, but they had no idea what the actual solution would be for a number of reasons. One, they don't know what footage existed. They don't know all the details. Same with a reader. They can tell you, oh, I really didn't like him at this point in the story. I thought what he did was stupid or something. When in fact, what they're responding to is something you set up earlier that made it so that his actions at that point didn't make any sense. And you kind of have to see the whole for that. A really good editor will be able to do that and show you, oh, look, you can go from here to there much faster. There's another chapter which is connected to this one called Cutting the Shoe Leather. And it's about try to get from A to B with nothing in between. Why do you have that stuff in between? And the example that I always go back to is the TV show Columbo, which is a classic show, 90 minutes long, could have been an hour long, because there's so much walking and driving and walking and walking and driving. And you don't need that stuff. If you see the contemporary version of that, which is Poker Face, it's on Peacock or something, but it is a very accurate homage to Columbo, where you see the murder in the first quarter of the show and you know who the killer is. And then the other 3/4 is our detective character solving it. They have eliminated all the shoe leather in that everything is there for a reason, which then leads to another problem when you're writing mysteries, because if everything is there for a reason, that means everything is important, which means red herrings are hard to put in there because you don't have time for them. So it's hard to balance both things of, I want to make sure that I'm cutting all the shoe leather, but I need to put in enough false clues. It just comes down to, if you have a good editor, they can look at it and go, you can end at this point on the page. You don't need that other page and a half. It's much stronger if you cut from here right to there.
And I suppose, again, a mechanical thing people could experiment with is take out the first chapter and see if you can live without it. You can't live without it as is, but maybe you say, oh, you know what? I realize I can encapsulate everything that first chapter said in a couple of lines of dialogue, or take out the first and last paragraphs of a chapter and see what happens. Like, I think it would be more of a, and see what happens than write the chapter and then just remove the first and last paragraphs. You can't just do that without then reassessing what your chapter is accomplishing.
Yeah. One of the overriding ideas in the book is you have to look at any of these things and say, what is my version of that? Because you're not going to make 100% version from what they're doing. You have to say, how does that work in my world? And I'll just give one example from my life in filmmaking. I, many, many years ago, wrote a sitcom pilot, which was produced by our local PBS station, a 30-minute sitcom with 4 characters. And they had hoped to do 6 episodes. So we wrote out treatments for 6 episodes and decided not to produce the pilot, but produce, I think, episode 3, because pilots tend to be a lot of setup and a lot of setup, So we wrote it and we gave it to the producer, and they said, well, because it's episode 3, but it's the first one we're going to shoot, you need to put in all the information about who they are and who the characters are, and they have to tell each other stuff they wouldn't tell each other, but they have to. So we did that, and they said, oh, that's really too much. Leave that, but I'm going to shoot a thing with one of the characters explaining everything. It'll be like a little thing comes at the beginning. Character will step on camera and say, hi, welcome to Comedy Friend. Here's what's going on. We said, well, we're going to do that. Let's cut out all this other stuff. Fine. So they have their little thing where someone explains what everything is, who everyone is, all the relationships. We cut all that out and just have a sitcom episode in which all the relationships are quite clear. They don't need to be explained. But anyway, so we shoot that. And they shoot their little introduction, and the introduction doesn't work. It's not shot properly or something. And they end up not using it. So we have this episode that didn't have any of the explanations in it, and it works just fine. We didn't need all those explanations. We didn't need to say, hi, I'm Cassie, and I'm new to the theater, and none of that was necessary. And as writers, we have a tendency to go, we have to explain everything. Well, no, people get stuff from context, and you can probably cut a lot of that if you find yourself explaining where everybody is.
What you had said about the original Columbo and a lot of driving and walking versus Poker Face, I think, is the current iteration, right?
Yes.
I think it's also important to remember to think about what your readers are looking for, especially if this isn't your first book. So I think for a while, the advice was cut until it's bare bones, because that's what readers want. That's certainly what a percentage of readers want. But I think there's also a percentage of readers out there who like the shoe leather. They like the driving. They like the walking. And so if you set that expectation with readers, like I tend to describe locations a lot. I set a lot of my stories in locations that are local to me. I live outside Philadelphia and I vacation in Maine, so I include a lot of details about Maine. And I often get happy comments about that in my reviews. So if I decided that it wasn't really necessary for people to know what the outside of the hotel looked like, I could cut that out, but I think people would miss it. And so again, consider what you want to be achieving and what expectation you set with people who have already read your books and liked what they read.
Right. Exactly.
So another principle under production is callbacks. Don't forget to reap what you sow. Are we already talking about that in this conversation? Or is that a different focus?
It's a slightly different focus. It's looking at your novel and seeing if you planted seeds early on that you didn't pay off or that you could pay off. And my favorite example of, I think, the best callback in the history of the world is the movie Casablanca, where at the end, Claude Rains says, round up the usual suspects, which is a line that is said once or twice early on in reference to the way he runs his police organization in Casablanca, which is we just grab people off the street and we're not really doing our jobs. And it's a great callback because it's an innocuous line early on that has tremendous resonance at the moment it's said at the end, because at the very end, Humphrey Bogart has shot Major Strasser. He is guilty of murder. Louis, played by Claude Rains, has seen him do it. And we learn at that moment, is their relationship a actual relationship or is it simply transactional and Louis is going to do what he needs to do? And Louis' men show up and he says, Major Strasser's been shot. And there's a pause and he says, round up the usual suspects. And that innocuous line all of a sudden tells us he is truly, for all of his flaws, he is a good friend to Humphrey Bogart and he's behind what Humphrey Bogart is doing, which is trying to stop the Nazis. What I love about that is, it's really strong and it's funny and it gets a laugh, but also the way it was found was Casablanca. If you've ever read books on the making of it, it's a classic example of the studio just scrambling to get stuff done and using whatever systems they have to do that. And there were several writers who worked on Casablanca, but while they were shooting, the Epstein brothers, who were twin brothers, worked on it. And they worked specifically on the ending. And they had, I believe, a several-page treatment of how the movie was going to end. And the problem they had was exactly that problem. If we kill Major Strasser, why does Claude Rains not turn in Humphrey Bogart? And as they were driving to work one day, they used to never work together. Out of the blue, they both turned to each other and said, round up the usual suspects. They remembered a line from earlier in the movie, a line they hadn't even written, but they remembered they've seen as much of the movie as had been shot. They knew that was going to be in there. That's a great way to tie it up. And I think a lot of times we have round up the usual suspects already in our books and we forget to pay them off, or we don't see that we can pay them off, that there is something that is innocuous at the beginning that can have tremendous meaning at the end, or just it can solve a problem that we didn't know how to solve. There's a very silly movie called Stuber, and in it, the main character has an electric car, and fun is made of the silent nature of the electric car early in the movie, and you forget about it, and it turns out to be a saving grace at the end of the movie. It's not only just planting these things, it's remembering at the end, bring them back, call it back. Audiences love a callback. They love to be in on it, to feel part of the events. And I just think it's something that it's easy to forget in the, rush to finish a book or to, my goodness, I'm at the end. I think you need to go back and go, what did I plant that I didn't pay off? What can I use that's already there? I had a screenwriting teacher when I was much younger who talked about organic screenwriting. And his theory was when you get to the end of the script, all the problems that you need to solve, the answers are already there. They're in the script if you just look for them. And I think the same is true of novels. When you run into a problem, you don't necessarily need to graft something on. Just look what you got so far and what have you forgotten about? What did you mention in passing that could really help you at this point? And that's the value of callbacks.
I actually realized that I did that with my most recent Ann Kinnear book, Be With the Dead, because at the beginning, Ann has been invited to a writers' conference to talk about her specialty, which is speaking with dead people. And so they've asked her to talk about making the supernatural super in your novel. That's the name of the talk they've asked her to give. And she's really crabby about it. Not only does she think the talk is kind of stupid, but she hates the idea of public speaking. And also during this book, she's dealing, as she often does, with people who find out about her professed skill and think she's lying or just crazy or something like that. And so at the end, I realized there's a twist that Anne can put on the title of her talk. I won't say what it is because I'd like to reserve that for people who read the story, but that really nicely summarizes that. And all I had to do was go back, and at some point someone says, "Oh yeah, I understand you're really not excited about doing that, making the supernatural super in your novel." And she said, "Well, it might be okay because I'm thinking of a twist on it." And then I paid that off at the end.
Yeah.
But it was nice because that was the 6th book, and I'm now moving to another series. And so there's going to be a little gap before the next Anne Kinnear book. And I wanted to have the final chapter be something that was meaningful enough that it would carry people forward until whenever book 7 comes out. And I thought that the twist Anne puts on it indicates that she has come to an understanding herself about her abilities. And so being able to tie it back, like you're saying, the fodder was there, and I was able to put it to work at the end of that book.
I'll give you one more example of someone who went back and found something. In I believe, the pilot episode of the TV show Veep with Julia Louis-Dreyfus. I think in passing, because there's some scandal she's involved with, and she wants the news media to turn away from it. And one of the throwaway lines is, "Why can't somebody die like Tom Hanks?" Okay, now flash forward 6, 7 seasons. I don't know. Different showrunner. The original guy, Armando's gone. David Mandel has taken over. It's the last episode. Ina, as played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, has died. Sorry, spoiler alert. And her funeral is being broadcast, and it is interrupted by a news report that Tom Hanks has just died. And so they're not going to go to her funeral any longer. That's an example of someone who didn't even write the thing, but who looked back and went, "There's something in season 1 pilot that I can call back 6 or 7 years later as a joke." It's a great freestanding joke by itself, but if you'd also know that it was referenced early on, that's why it's smart to just go back and look at it. Look at those seeds you planted and see what can you pay off. The downside is make sure the seed isn't too big and that you're not paying it off too soon, because then it becomes this obvious thing that the example I always come back to, there's this cozy mystery I read where a secondary character got a taser in like chapter 3, and in chapter 5, she used it to save her life. And it was supposed to be sort of a throwaway thing, but it wasn't thrown away because they made a big deal out of it, and then she used it way too quickly. So make sure that you planted smaller seeds a little deeper and that they're further away from when you actually sow them.
So we're going to move on to post-production now. We're going to be talking about 2 of the several principles in post-production, and that is getting notes. So talk about what you mean by getting notes.
Yeah, well, getting notes are, you've given the book out to your beta readers and they're coming back to you with their thoughts on it. In the movie world and the TV world, you have a preview audience, or you can show it to an audience and they give you cards back, or they have focus groups. What I'm talking about here is more a one-on-one sort of thing. It's very important to let people tell you what they think, but it's also very important for you to go yes or no to that. You don't have to say it to their face, but it's like, take it in. There's a writer named Amy Holden Jones who wrote Mystic Pizza and Indecent Proposal. And her rule of thumb is if I show up to 5 people and one person has a problem with something, I don't worry about it. If 4 of them do, then I worry about it. And that's true with your beta readers. If only one person doesn't like something about it and everybody else is fine with it, then I wouldn't worry about it. But there's also an etiquette to giving notes. I don't give notes unless I'm asked, because I wasn't asked to do it. And, sometimes you just want to just run up to somebody and say, "Here's the problem with your book." So there's a book that I read called Maximum Entertainment 2.0, which is designed for performers. And it has a million different tips on how to be a better performer. But it also has one whole section on getting and giving notes and the politics of doing it, how to do it politely. And a couple of them stuck out for me. If someone's asked you to give them notes on their book, I would immediately say, do it in private. Don't be standing at a cocktail party telling them what they should change. If you can, do it in writing, because it's just easier to take that sort of thing in. If you're getting the notes, don't argue. There's no need to argue. Just take in the note. And also don't really do anything with the note for a couple days or a week. Let it sit. Sometimes there's a tendency you get notes and you go, I got to go into the document right now, make that change. Unless you're on some sort of weird time schedule, I would say hold off on that because you might get other contradictory notes or you might get a better idea of what the note really is addressing. Because a lot of times the note is addressing a problem, but it's not that specific point it's something earlier that it's really addressing. And you need to think about that. So while you want your note giver to be as specific as possible, you as the person who's getting the notes can realize the problem they're talking about is not really there. It's earlier.
Yeah. And if anyone is interested in delving into that in more detail, in episode 88, I spoke with Tiffany Yates Martin about how to receive and give critique. So that would be a good companion piece to this conversation. And then the last principle we're going to talk about is don't hesitate to hesitate. So I'm curious about that one.
Yeah, so it's my favorite. When I made a bunch of low budget movies and I wrote a couple books on how to do that. One of them was about the greatest low budget movies of all time and what you can learn from them. And one was with screenwriters about low budget movies. So I had a chance to talk to a lot of people, a lot of big directors and writers, and in some cases actors, and got some fabulous information. The stuff which was pertinent to novelists I put into this book, but there's tons more. But one of the best conversations I had was with Bob Odenkirk, who is probably best known now for Better Call Saul and being on Breaking Bad. But at the time I talked to him, he just made a movie called Melvin Goes to Dinner, which is a highly recommended little indie movie about four friends who get together for dinner. And it literally is that. It's 90 minutes of them at dinner. It's kind of like My Dinner with Andre, but there's cutaways to the stories that they're telling. And in asking him advice about, what he learned doing that, he said, one thing I always tell people is don't hesitate to hesitate. And then of course he pauses because it's like, what do those words mean? What it means is don't race on to the next thing. In his parlance, he was talking about if you're on a movie set and you've shot a scene and you've got all the angles you want and you think you have it covered, don't hesitate to hesitate. Take a moment, step back and look at where you are. I've got these actors. I got these cameras, light, that, all this stuff. Is there anything else I should be doing with what's in front of me? Take a moment and get everything you can out of that situation. Now, like I said, all these precepts that I got from filmmakers, I've had to look at what's my version of that. And for me, when it comes to writing, when you get to the end, you have this feeling of, I'm done. Okay, let's get it out of here. And I think you should hesitate. I think you should let it simmer for a little bit, put it in a drawer, and then come back and look at it and see, what can I fix? What can I change? Is that still working? It's so much easier to do that at that point when you're still in that world, but you've stepped away from it a bit, as opposed to, as has happened to many of us, I'm sure, a year later when you go, oh, I know what I should have done at that. Oh, oh my goodness, that would have been a much better way to end that scene. So it's just one of the other things mentioned in the book is the idea of time is on your side. And when in the low budget film world, generally one thing you have that they don't have in big Hollywood movies is you have time, because you're not paying people to be there. Generally, you're not paying for locations. You can take your time. And the book has examples of movies that were made simply because they had enough time to do it. Well, the same is true, unless you're under some strict contract, the same is true of us when we're writing a book. You can take as much time as you want. You don't have to do 3 books a year. If you want to do a book every 2 years, that's fine. When you're done, you don't have to be done. You can let it sit and come back to it. Using that thing, time, to our advantage is something that someone who is, contracted to write 2 books a year for Random House or something doesn't have. That's an advantage we have. We can take the time to step away. When I talked to Steven Soderbergh about Sex, Lies, and Videotape, he said of all the movies he ever made, and that was his very first one, he said, that was the only movie where I felt like I didn't have a gun to my head because I didn't have, a studio behind me with $45 million. I could take my time. He said, I still use that today, that idea, but what I do is I checkerboard projects. So I'll be working on something and I'll take a break from it and work on something else, take a break from that and come back to the first one. So I'm using time to my advantage. And it's a commodity that I think we sometimes forget that we have that the big publishers don't have. They're racing all the time. We don't have to do that.
Do you have any recommendation for how long an author should let their work rest, where they're able to have that bit of distance from it, but not so long that you become like intellectually and emotionally disconnected from that work?
I think that's going to be different for everybody. I know I read Lawrence Block wrote once about he had got, I think, 30,000, 40,000 words into a book and got lost. And he set it aside and he picked it up several years later and started writing from the point that he'd left off. And I don't remember which book it was, but I remember reading it and thinking, I don't know where he left off. I have no idea where he left off. The guy who made Repo Man, Alex Cox, as with many of the things that I learned in talking to all these people, for every idea, there's someone who has the absolute opposite idea. And Alex Cox has never put something writing into a drawer because it'll never come out. I don't think that's really true. I like to let stuff sit for at least 2 weeks and then come back to it. But everybody's going to be different on that. I just think it's the idea of step away just for a bit. You got the time, step away and come at it with new eyes.
Oh, cool. Well, John, there is tons more principles in the Popcorn Principles, a novelist's guide to learning for movies. And we could spend the next several episodes talking about them, but we should let the listeners and viewers know where they can go to find that book and everything else you do online.
Well, they can find it anywhere online where you buy books. It is one of my few books that is wide. I also recorded the audiobook of it all by myself, which was really interesting. Having never done that before. I mean, I've made audiobooks. I've just never been the narrator. So that was quite a process. You can, if you want to go right to my website, it's albertsbridgebooks.com. That's albertsbridgebooks.com. You can find Popcorn Principles there, along with Eli Marks Mysteries and the filmmaking books and the Gomolid Players and the Greyhound books. Everything's at albertsbridgebooks.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matty. It's always fun to talk to you.